Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that in our previous two sessions, we talked deliberately on theories of revolution in comparative politics. We have covered two sessions and today also we are going to get in-depth knowledge on the topic that is theories of revolution in comparative politics. Dear friends, today the theories which we are going to take or which we are going to talk about is around the modern revolution theories, and we would be specifically talking on the theories of Mahatma Gandhi and Jayaprakash Narayan, but we would be talking in context to the historical, structural as well as psychological schools, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha has immense experience and he is contributing immensely in the field of academics too. Everywhere he tries to give his input so that the student community could get in-depth knowledge on various topics. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and let's try to understand today's topic in detail, that is theories of revolution in comparative politics. This is the concluding lecture and we are going to get more and more from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika ji, and good afternoon. Today's lecture is the third part of our three-part series on theory of revolution in comparative politics. In fact, in earlier two parts we have discussed many issues, including the issue that how to understand revolution, how to distinguish revolution from other similar collective acts like rebellion, insurgency, and so on and so forth. So these conceptual issues we have had discussion in earlier parts of the lecture, but along with that we also discussed different ways to interpret great revolutionary upsurges in history, particularly the three important revolutionary moments, that is the French, American, and and the British experiences in history. So this is what we had discussed in our earlier lecture. But one thing is also important to remember, that in 18th and 19th centuries there were many thinkers who tried to reflect on those revolutions, and it is in this context that in earlier lectures we had discussed the ideas of Burke, we had discussed the idea of Paine, we had discussed the idea of Tocqueville, and so many other thinkers. In the second part of our discussion, we had discussed the Marxist understanding of revolution, which is very important from the point of view of both understanding this entire issue of revolution as well as from the point of view of comparative politics and political science. In context of Marx, in fact, what we discussed in the second part, I would like to recapitulate briefly so that we could move further today, because today's main focus would be on the 20th centuries, theories which were built in 20th century so far as revolution is concerned or understanding of revolution is concerned. Now, in fact, the 20th century started with some very significant contributions by comparative politics experts, and in this context, in fact, what we will be doing here, that we will be discussing 3-4 important schools as well as their protagonists. The historical school or historical explanation, one can say, and here we will be discussing Crane Brinton, we will be discussing Barrington Moore Jr., and the structuralist school we will be discussing with reference to Theda Skocpol. Social psychological school we will be discussing Tedgar, and for sociological explanation we will be discussing Chalmers Johnson's. So this is what we will be covering in next 1 hour in course of our discussion. So far as 20th century theories about revolution go. But before doing that, in fact, it is is an order that we should have a brief account of what we discussed about Marx's theory of revolution. In fact, in context of Marx, I had mentioned that unlike other philosophers who preceded him, Marx believed that the job of the philosopher is not simply to interpret but to change. That famous statement which he made and which is often cited in support of this revolutionary nature of Marxist theory or the Marxist discourse and the Marxist doctrine. Now, therefore, this revolutionary change for Marx is very important, and it is here that people make a distinction between utopian socialism and scientific socialism, because the major difference was that utopian socialism also talked about egalitarianism and equitable distribution of resources, but then there was no way to secure that society. There was no roadmap. There was no blueprint that how that society could be achieved. Whereas in Marxian ideas, what we find that not only he advocated a socialist society, but also gave a blueprint to bring about a revolutionary change, and hence it is called, or he called it, a scientific socialism opposed to utopian socialism. Now, in context of Marx's notion of revolution, we have discussed that how historical materialism is at the heart of this entire theory, because what Marx advocated was a social revolution through contradiction of material forces, and that is why in fact this historical materialist interpretation of history is important for understanding Marx's theory of revolution. For Marx, it is not ideas which are the driving force of history, rather it is the matter which makes difference. It is the matter which is the motor force of history, and it is on basis of this entire dialectical approach which he applied. Of course, he borrowed from Hegel, but as it is well known that he basically turned it upside down, because for Hegel, ideas were the driving force of history, but Marx basically supplanted it with matter, and for him matter became the driving force of history, and this is how this materialist interpretation of history comes into existence in his hands. Now, of course, what Marx also alluded to, that there are certain processes through which history moves, and that is perhaps evolutionary process, largely on account of the influence which came on him from Darwin, or Darwin's theory of evolution, and then at the same time the theory of contradiction which he explained in terms of structural terms, that how in every historical epoch, due to evolution of material forces, at certain stage contradictory nature also surfaces, and due to those contradictions the evolution is pushed forward. So therefore, this theory of contradiction, and it is in this context that I had also discussed in my earlier lecture the base superstructure explanation about the social formation in Marx, and the base, which is the economic structure of society, which is perhaps the determining factor. So far Marx's entire understanding of social and economic and the political structure of society is concerned. Of course, this economic structure, the base which he called, includes forces of production and relations of production, which is also called mode of production, and it is this relationship between base and between the forces and relations in this entire understanding of revolution, as basically advocated by Marx, what we find that is key to this entire social revolution, or basically the argument for social revolution, because it is in terms of this contradiction between the forces and relations that ultimately the argument for revolution comes in Marxist theory. What happened, that forces have a tendency to develop, that is the technology, that is the means of production and many other things, and what happened, the relations, which is basically between human and human, that relationship at different stages in history start acting as a fetter on the growth of those forces and becomes an obstruction, and therefore that becomes a contradiction, that forces are not allowed to grow because of the relations of production, and therefore those classes, according to this theory, whose interests suffer on account of this obstruction, they come and try to remove this fetter, and this is how the revolution takes place. So this is the argument, theoretical argument, which Marx put forth in support of this revolutionary change in society, and it is on basis of this that he classified different transitions, different revolutions in history, from primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to socialism, and the final stage which would be communism, which is perhaps the desired goal according to this theory. So this is what is known as the primary theory of revolution in Karl Marx. But what I was trying to mention in my last lecture also, and I will also touch upon this issue briefly before I move to the 20th century theory, that this primary theory of revolution, as I mentioned, based on this nature of transition and evolution from primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism, and then finally socialism and communism, in fact very important role is assigned to capitalism or the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Because ultimately it is the capitalism, the bourgeois revolution in history, which is perhaps the basis on which a more egalitarian and human society, that is the socialism, is basically desired, envisioned and basically argued for. Because ultimately the bourgeois revolution, though it is exploitative, but a different type of role it plays in history, a progressive role in terms of the growth of productive forces, and therefore it is the capitalism which creates the conditions of abundance on basis of which the egalitarian distribution happens after the socialist revolution takes place. So therefore bourgeois revolution, the capitalist revolution, is very important in Marx's theory of revolution, and this is what he envisioned, and therefore he also thought that revolution would take place in advanced capitalist societies of Europe. And unfortunately, one can say that these revolutions didn't take place in the advanced capitalist countries, but took place in a backward country like Russia, and therefore this entire argument for the subsidiary theory of revolution in Karl Marx. Now this was the primary theory, but the revolutions happened based on Marxist doctrine were not based on the primary theory of revolution, but subsidiary theory of revolution. That is, revolution didn't take place in advanced capitalist society, but revolutions took place in a backward country like Russia, which didn't have similar type of industrialization and growth of capitalism as many European countries like Britain, France, and so on and so forth. So therefore, many scholars have pointed out that history played a trick with Karl Marx, that the revolution was brought about in a country which was not ideally suited for him, or according to his theory, for this revolutionary transformation or revolutionary transition towards socialism. Now this subsidiary theory on Marx is also based on some of the writings which he produced, including 1848, that famous piece of writing, that is Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, published in 1848 in context of the abortive revolution in Europe. Because around 1848 there was every possibility that revolutions would break out in many countries of Europe, but it didn't happen, and that forced him to look back and basically reflect that what went wrong. And it is in this context that this tract of Marx emerges, the Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany. Along with this, another piece of writing of his collaborator Engels, that is the Peasant War in Germany, which was written in 1850. These two texts are important texts from the point of view of understanding the subsidiary theory of revolution in Marx and Marxian ideas. And therefore, what is the argument in this subsidiary theory of particular revolution and counter-revolution in Germany in 1848? Marx argued that the bourgeoisie, as expected, will not make a bourgeois revolution even. In fact, bourgeoisie is expected to bring about bourgeois revolution, the capitalist transition, but after analyzing the situation of 1848, Marx came to this conclusion that bourgeoisie will not make even the bourgeois revolution, and therefore he argued that the proletariat has to be ready even for the bourgeois revolution, because proletariat will have to push for this bourgeois revolution, because bourgeoisie would be reluctant. And therefore, in fact, this was a very important set of arguments. And on basis of this, what we find that Lenin practiced this subsidiary theory in Russia in 1917 when the Bolshevik revolution took place. Marx himself could not practice it, but Lenin practiced it. But then there was another few arguments which also emerged in light of this abortive revolution of 1848, that is in relation to peasantry role of peasants. Because in the primary theory, the peasants were not assigned important role, because it was ultimately the working class which was the agent of change. It was the proletariat which was the major revolutionary subject in this revolutionary theory. But later on, the role of peasants was also accepted. For example, when Marx made this statement that France has defeated Paris, that is the countryside had defeated cities, that is the peasants have defeated the working class, this statement was also suggestive of this fact. So what we find that this subsidiary theory which emerged from the Marxist writing itself, later on got translated into action in Russia by Lenin, and therefore what we find that when we discuss revolution or theories of revolution in Marx, we have two theories, the primary theory and the subsidiary theory. And interestingly, the subsidiary theory in course of time has become the theory, because most of the revolutions have taken place for the purpose of bringing socialism as per Marxian ideas, based on subsidiary theory, not the primary theory. That is not in advanced capitalist countries, but in the backward countries, be it Russia or China. So therefore, what happens that in Marx we find these two different theories of revolution. Now Lenin, of course, built on these ideas, and also came out some of his own understanding, because some of the writings of Lenin are also important for understanding revolution in Marxist theory, including the two famous writings, State and Revolution and What is to be Done. These two writings, which were produced by Lenin, in fact they are very important source to understand this entire theory of revolution in Marx. But what is important here, that there are three issues which emerges, a particular role of party, dictatorship of the proletariat, socialism in one country, and all these issues emerge in context of this revolution which took place in Soviet Union. That is basically whether socialism should be confined to one country, or there should be effort to bring about a revolution in different countries. This is how Trotsky and Stalin debate also took place at that time, because Stalin was in favor of limiting socialism in one country, that is Soviet Union. Trotsky and others were arguing for internationalism or international communist revolution. So therefore this is what happened. Now Plekhanov, which is considered the father of Russian Marxism, though he endorsed the kind of subsidiary theory based revolution which was brought about in Soviet Union, but he also cautioned against the premature realization of socialism, and therefore one can see that it is not that the thinkers and the scholars of this school were not aware of the limitations and the distortions which will creep in, particularly in light of the subsidiary theory based revolution, but nonetheless they endorsed it, particularly in March and October revolutions in Soviet Union. In Russia, this Kerensky regime, and that was a bourgeois regime, and how it was basically immediately superseded by a socialist proletarian revolution, the dictatorship of proletariat in terms of Leninist formulation. So this is some of the important issues we find that got crystallized in context of Soviet Union, particularly the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Now what is important to remember, that Lenin was critiqued by many people who subscribe to this doctrine, including Rosa Luxemburg. He criticized Lenin for undermining the spontaneity of the working class. In fact, she wanted a dialectical reciprocity between masses, intellectuals and political leaders, something which later on was also expounded by Italian Marxist philosopher Gramsci. Now, but what is important here to remember, that someone like Bernstein, who was against this type of revolution and revolutionary change which was brought about or basically was being advocated and practiced, and therefore what later on emerged as a doctrine of democratic socialism or Eurocommunism. In fact, his 1899 writing or book, that is called Evolutionary Socialism, is a very important piece of writing for understanding this entire issue of revolution and the debates around revolution within the Marxist theory. Now, of course, Bernstein was heavily influenced by Fabianism. In fact, he found a cleavage between Marxist theory and then existing reality, and therefore he advocated gradualism the way Fabian socialists advocate gradualism. Of course, in fact, on Bernstein there are many influences, including the influence of Louis Blanc and Lassalle, the German social democrat philosopher with whom Marx also had some sort of disagreement, and therefore Bernstein echoed what Lassalle and earlier Louis Blanc had advocated so far as the gradual transition towards socialism and based on democratic state is concerned. So therefore what happens that gradually you find that many ideas came out of this Marxist theory of revolution. Within Marxism, of course, there was a debate, and then there were many other philosophers, thinkers who parted company with Marxism and had a altogether different churning, different thinking on this issue, and Eurocommunism is one such example. In fact, in 20th century, some Marxist philosophers tried to build on Marx's idea and try to supplement with some new fresh ideas and fresh insights, including Gramsci, particularly the way Antonio Gramsci, Italian Marxist philosopher, talked about the role of intellectuals, the way he talked about the hegemony of the ruling class, and the way he emphasized the role of ideology and counter-ideology in revolutionary struggles, which was perhaps not considered that important in classical Marxist writing, both in terms of the primary theory of revolution and subsidiary theory of revolution. Similarly, later on we find that in context of Algeria, French Fanon, who wrote a very important book, Wretched of the Earth, particularly in context of the colonial rule and the kind of violence which is unleashed by the colonial rulers. In fact, that is also a very important contribution from the point of view of Marxist theory. Though, of course, many new insights and many deviations one can find in Fanon. For example, French Fanon tried to problematize the question of colonial rule in the colonies, that how this leads to a structural violence, and therefore how it leads to violation of the dignity of the subjects, the colonized people. And therefore he made a distinction between revolutionary violence and the repressive violence, and he justified revolutionary violence of the oppressed. Now, of course, one thing one should remember, that Fanon, apart from glorifying the violence of the oppressed, also talked about the peasants as a revolutionary subject, which was one issue, important issue within Marxist theory from the very beginning. As I mentioned earlier, peasants' war in Germany, what Engels argued, or what Marx had stated when he made this statement that France has defeated Paris, that how peasants have basically ditched the cause of the working class. So within Marxist, classical Marxist theory, there was a realization that the peasants should be assigned important role in revolutionary transformation, which was not done in terms of its classical theory. So Fanon, in fact, came back to this issue and made peasants as the main agent of revolutionary transformation or subject of history. So therefore, he believed that the workers are small and they are non-revolutionary, and in that context, in fact, he thought that national bourgeoisie was making compromises with the colonial rulers, and in that context, particularly in context of Algeria, he thought that the peasants would be playing the most important role. Of course, there are many criticisms of Fanon, but I don't have time to go into all those details. Now, one thing we should remember, that when revolution was brought about in China, when Mao Zedong tried to practice this entire subsidiary theory of revolution in China the way Lenin practiced it in Russia. In fact, he also made many novel experiments, including assigning important role to the peasants, the way perhaps this was being realized within the Marxist theory, apart from certain other contributions which Mao made in terms of enriching this entire theory of revolution, in fact, in Marx. So therefore, what happened that Mao, Fanon and others, the way they made peasants as a revolutionary agent, or one can say the subject of revolution, which was not there earlier within the subsidiary theory when it was practiced in Russia, but it happened in China, it happened in Algeria, and so on and so forth. So this is something we should understand, that how revolutionary theory, or the theory of revolution within Marxism, developed from classical primary theory to subsidiary theory to revisionism of Bernstein type, and then of course a debate on socialism in one country and the role of peasants and so on and so forth, and a status of violence, particularly in reference to Fanon. Now, in discussing theory of revolution, in fact, if we ignore some of the Indian contributions, the entire discussion will remain inadequate. And it is here that we have to understand the ideas and the writings of two important Indian thinkers, Gandhi and Jayaprakash Narayan. In fact, Gandhi, of course, talked about a different type of change and transformation in society. In fact, he argued and advocated a non-violent change. And this is something is quite well known, that he basically thought that means are as important, rather more important than end. And therefore, any social transition or social change is brought about with the help of violent means, that end will always remain defective. So therefore, in context of colonialism, the way Fanon glorified revolution, in fact, Marx basically abjured revolution. Rather, he condemned it. And therefore, he thought that any revolutionary, change brought about with the help of violence would be counterproductive. So this is how one can see that Gandhi stands on another side of the extreme so far as this entire revolutionary change is concerned. His entire, the subject, revolutionary subject in the Gandhian discourse is a satyagrahi, who is basically, a kind of, who stands for truth, who stands for non-violence, who stand for sacrifice and sufferings. Unlike other revolutionary theories where you have the classes, the class interests and other things which are basically included. Now another Indian thinker, the JP, Jayaprakash Narayan, who talked of a total revolution and also started a campaign for a complete transformation of society in mid-70s based on an idea of total revolution, and this is what is known in Indian politics as JP movement. Now of course he also, like Gandhi, basically detested violence, because he thought that any revolutionary change on violence would be counterproductive, because violence would beget violence would lead to centralization, and therefore it would not allow a decentralized power structure in society, because ultimately democracy stands for decentralization. So JP's entire purpose of total revolution was to bring about a change which will be democratic in nature. And of course he was also a socialist, but then also he had a tremendous influence of Gandhi on him. So therefore one can find a lot of similarity between JP and Gandhi in terms of this abjuring violence as a method for revolution. So therefore one thing should also be remembered in context of JP here, that Jayaprakash Narayan also talked of the youth, the students, as agent of change. And it is in this context that a lot of people make comparison between the new left political philosopher Marcuse and JP, because Marcuse, who was of course a protagonist of the new and the critical school, the Frankfurt school, also advocated change. He was also Marxist to some extent, and therefore he also believed in revolutionary change, but he argued that the working class would no longer be bringing any revolutionary change in society in 20th century. And he was also talking about new agents of change, and he talked of youth. He talked of intelligentsia, all those who were outside the production process. Only they could be now agent of change in history, not those who are associated with production process, that is working class. Now many people make comparison between Jayaprakash Narayan and Marcuse's idea that the way JP considered students as a very important agent of change, revolutionary change. In fact, this Marcuse also talked of the youth. But these are some of the theories which one can see coming from outside Marxist fold and outside from the Western context, particularly in context of colonies. That is what Fanon talked about, this is what Gandhi talked about, it is Jayaprakash talked about. 20th century starts with many important contributions in comparative politics. And here, in fact, 3-4 contributions stand out. One is Hannah Arendt, the second is, of course, Tedgar, which is a social psychological approach. Then you have Chalmers Johnson, the structural functionalist. Then you have the two important historical explanations of revolution, Crane Brinton and Barrington Moore. And that would be followed by the very important contribution by Theodore Skocpol, that is a structuralist explanation. With these 4 or 5 explanations, we will be in a position to understand that how theory of revolution has basically emerged in comparative politics.
So thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. Dear friends, we will be meeting again after a short break, so you are requested to be with us. Thank you so very much. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Dear friends, as you know that today we are talking on theories of revolution in comparative politics. Friends, we are talking in context to the modern theories of revolution, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is an eminent professor of political science, and we believe that you are getting the in-depth knowledge on today's topic through him. So let's welcome our guest Dr. Satish Kumar Jha and let's carry forward the lecture. Hello sir, welcome back to the
Thank you. In fact, the earlier part of our discussion, what we tried to do, that we recapitulated some of the issues which were earlier discussed in the two other parts of our discussion on revolution. What I will be doing in next half an hour, that some of the important contributions which have emerged in 20th century in comparative politics and political science for understanding this entire issue called revolution. We will be focusing on that. And as I mentioned earlier, in fact, there are 2-3 important schools, so to say, which have emerged. One is, of course, the historical school. Second is, in fact, the social psychological school. Third is the sociological school, and the fourth is the structuralist school. And all schools have some advocates and protagonists. For example, for historical school, normally it is believed that Crane, Brinton, and Barrington Moore Jr. they provided, were excellent explanations, to analyze and explain 3 or 4 important revolutions in human history in modern time. That is, the French, American, British, and some of them have also used Russian and Chinese. So therefore, in fact, these revolutions have been used as the site to test the explanation. On basis of these revolutions, they have basically given certain hypotheses and they have tried to validate their theories. Similarly, the social psychological approach has been operationalized by Tedgar, who wrote a very interesting book, Why Men Rebel. And in that book, he has using Freudian psychology, particularly after having influenced by Freud and Jung, the two eminent psychologists, Tedgar tries to explain the causes of revolution in psychological terms. Similarly, Chalmers Johnson, after onset of a structural functionalist revolution in social science, he used functionalist method to explain revolution, that why revolutions take place. And finally, in last 3 decades, we have seen Theodore Skocpol. She has come out with a very interesting structuralist explanation so far as revolution is concerned. So these are the 4 important schools of thought. But before I move to these 4 schools, in fact, one thing we should remember, that there is one radical liberal thinker called Hannah Arendt, about whom I had alluded earlier also, and she is also a very important thinker from the point of view of understanding revolution. She wrote a book called On Revolution, and the argument which she puts forth is equally interesting. She says that every attempt to solve social question by political means invariably has led to terror. So therefore, what she means by social question is the material destitution and inequality. So for her, what is important, that these social issues, that is inequality, destitution, should not be tackled through political means or through agency of politics. Now, what is this all about? In fact, it is on this basis that she makes distinction between the French and the American revolutions. Of course, for her, the American Revolution is an ideal type, a model, because she feels that that what happened, that in France, the singular calamity of the French Revolution was the terror, because what happened, that the constitutional instability, as well as many other things which followed, including the reign of terror and many other things, were largely on account of this issue, because the French Revolution tried to tackle the social question, that is the question of destitution and social inequality, with politics, and therefore it led to a regime which is equated with terror. Now, what happens in United States of America, that is interesting for her. She argues that in America, they ignored social question of the day. In fact, what happened, that Constitution was able to limit the ambit of political power, what we know checks and balances, that checkmating power with power. This is perhaps the American constitutionalism. And therefore, what happened, according to Hannah Arendt, that the Americans secured the domain of public freedom. Of course, in fact, she also argues that the slavery treatment of Native Americans were the important issues, but they were ignored in the founding moments, because it was realized that if these issues would be tackled through the instrumentality of politics, then perhaps the result could be disastrous, perhaps the way it happened in France. And therefore, according to Hannah Arendt, it was a judicious choice for the Americans what they did, particularly in terms of ignoring those social issues at the founding moments. And of course, he also makes a very a perceptive observation that there were some enabling factors also present in the United States of America, unlike France. That is, the mass poverty was substantially absent, particularly in United States of America, unlike in France in 18th century, and therefore Americans were fortunate to have basically escaped this tragedy, because even if they couldn't tackle social question by political means, it didn't impact them or didn't have much repercussions, political repercussions. So therefore, this is Hannah Arendt's understanding of a revolution, and particularly the post-revolutionary fallouts, particularly point of view of this freedom, particularly as I mentioned earlier in my first lecture, that makes a distinction between liberation and freedom, that basically revolutionary transformations are equated with freedom, not only liberation. So therefore, in fact, this intermingling of political power with social issues, which led to terror in France and became absolute, created absolutist regime. In fact, how it was escaped in the United States of America is subject matter of Hannah Arendt's discussion of a revolution. And for her, American Constitution, the American discourse of freedom is ideal. And therefore, in fact, one thing one should also remember, that it was the French model which was influential in 19th and 20th century, not the American model, that is using political means for settling social issues. Perhaps this Hannah Arendt, what she is saying about United States of America, was not replicated in many other countries. So this is something about Hannah Arendt. Now coming to some other theories, which we discussed earlier, the 20th century theory. And it is here that these theories are important. Now, of course, Hannah Arendt's on revolution we have already seen, but then there are Chalmers Johnson's, particularly the structural functionalist approach, Tedgar, Why Men Rebel. Then you have Crane Brinton, his famous book Anatomy of Revolution, particularly the study of the English Revolution of 1688, French Revolution of 1789, the Russian Revolution of 1917. And then Barrington Moore Jr., Social Origin of Dictatorship and Democracy, Lord and Peasants in Making of Modern World, which was written in 1966, particularly from the point of view of 6 important revolutions in history. Barrington Moore Jr. talks about England, France, USA, Russia, Germany, Japan, and also refers to India. In fact, in other words, one can say that for Barrington Moore Jr., there are 3 different routes to modernization. And revolution stands for modernization, that is industrialization and capitalist development. And 3 different routes he discusses in his book, which is a very important contribution. And finally, Theda Skocpol, State and Revolution, which was published in 1979, and she represents a structuralist school. But before we move to this historical structuralist and social, and structural functionalist, let's have of the social psychological approach, which is best represented by Tedgar, particularly the famous book which he wrote, Why Men Rebel. That is the argument, psychological argument which he provides. Tedgar, in this book, Why Men Rebel, provides aggregate psychological approach to this issue of revolution. Now this, for Tedgar, as I was mentioning earlier, was influenced by 2 eminent psychologists or 2 thinkers from using psychological psychoanalysis. One was Freud, another was Jung. Of course, for Tedgar, violence is personified, violence is basically rooted in personality structure of individual, and therefore frustration and deprivation have a psychological dimension. This has not much to do with the material conditions, rather it is a psychological state of mind. For example, the way Freud talked about libido and aggression are the 2 basic instincts in human beings. Tedgar, in fact, uses the similar psychoanalytical method to understand this entire sense of deprivation in human beings, that is, why men rebel. And according to Tedgar, it is not absolute deprivation, but it is the relative deprivation, which acts as a basically causal link between revolutionary change or revolutionary transformation of society and the perception of individual. Therefore, what happened that according to Tedgar, when large number of people suffer, then what happens that due to the sufferance, a common identity develops among them, and that identity plays important role, the formation of identity, and therefore it is a psychological issue, not the socio-economic issues which basically other thinkers have, other theorists have tried to discuss in their discussion of a revolution. Now, what is frustration? But the thing is that there are many criticisms also of Tedgar. How to measure this frustration? What would be the indicator of this frustration? And therefore, what frustration leads to violence and what frustration does not lead to violence. And therefore, in fact, it is also difficult to see that how this individual psychology gets transformed into group psychology. And the critics point out that Tedgar, though, brings very important insights into this entire understanding of revolution by focusing on individual psychology and group psychology, but it ignores the social structural dimension of society. And therefore, in fact, this entire issue of relative deprivation is important issue which was not discussed earlier, but nonetheless Tedgar's explanation suffers from many shortfalls. So this is something about Tedgar. Now, after Tedgar, there is another important theory, and this is theory of structural functionalism, which was basically put forth by Chalmers Johnson, particularly in event of this structural functional revolution in social science. Now, Chalmers Johnson wrote a book called Revolutionary Change in 1966, and that book turned out to be a very important piece of writing from the point of view of theories of revolution. In fact, what Chalmers Johnson does, that he puts premium on the values for collective action. That is, how value consensus is created in society. And therefore, he also tries to explain that all revolutions or revolutionary transformations or revolutionary changes occur when this value consensus in society is undermined or threatened. In fact, Chalmers Johnson provides an equilibrium model of understanding, equilibrium model to understand this entire revolutionary change. That because of this value consensus, what happens in society, a equilibrium is created. And when there is a questioning of this value consensus, then this equilibrium suffers some setback. And therefore, what we find that Tedgar on the one hand did social psychological analysis, Chalmers Johnson tries to offer a sociological explanation of this entire phenomenon. That is how values are created, how value consensus is built in society. So therefore, what we find that from deprivation we move to value consensus. In Tedgar we have a deprivation index. On the other hand, in Chalmers Johnson's we have a value consensus explanation. Chalmers Johnson also underlines 3-4 important factors or the causes of a revolutionary change. And one important factor is, according to Chalmers Johnson, is elites' transigence. That when elites are intransigent, insensitive, then such changes, the possibility of changes are quite prominent. The second important factor which he underlined is that when system has, when system loses the capacity to sustain stress and strain, then also such changes are quite possible. So therefore, in fact, what happens that from the structural functionalist point of view, the 2-3 things are highlighted in Chalmers Johnson's: the formation of value consensus, the threat to value consensus, the stress and strain on it. That is, when the values are basically under stress, then such changes happen. and it is here that he holds basically the intelligentsia, the elites responsible for this, because if they are insensitive, then these changes can always happen. In fact, therefore the attitude of the elites, if they are basically keen for reforms, then such changes can be prevented. Because if the elites are open for reforms, for example, he gives the example of China, that if Kuomintang in China would have agreed for reforms, then peasants would not have basically sided with Mao the way perhaps they did in 1949 to bring about revolutionary change in China. So therefore, this is from a structural functionalist point of view, Chalmers-Johnson's explanation of revolution. There are many criticisms. A lot of scholars have said that this value consensus is a highly status quoist argument, that there is a value consensus, and when consensus is questioned, there will be revolutionary change. How in a class divided society, the consensus can happen, because every class has its own set of values. And number two, there is no method to test his argument in context of China, that if Kuomintang would have agreed for reforms, peasants would not have sided with Mao. And number three, many scholars point out that like other structural functionalist arguments, in fact Chalmers-Johnson also takes recourse to tautology, particularly when it comes to justify or validate its hypothesis. So this is what we see in context of a structural functionalist school and its explanation of a revolution. Now coming back to this historical school, which is a very important school from the point of view of understanding revolution in 20th century. And it is here that the contributions of Crane Brinton and Barrington Moore Jr. become very important. Now this Crane Brinton, who wrote a very famous book, Anatomy of Revolution. Now this Crane Brinton's book, Anatomy of Revolution, is a study of four revolutions in history of modern times: English, American, French, and Russian. What Brinton does, that he neither recommends revolution nor he decries it. Rather, in fact, he says that he is doing an objective analysis of revolutionary upheaval in history. Now, interestingly, Brinton does a fever analogy of revolution. He equates revolution with fever. In fact, he takes a pathological view of revolution and compare revolutions with fever and society with a body. The way if body becomes ill, one gets fever. Similarly, if society becomes ill, revolution takes place. So there is an analogy of fever in his discussion of revolution. Brinton argues the way a fever kills many germs in body, similarly after revolution, a society may emerge stronger, because all deformities and all germs of illness would be killed through revolution. So this is the analogy, the important analogy in Crane Brinton so far as revolution is concerned. Now he tries to find out certain patterns which are true to all revolutions, at least the four revolutions which he discusses. And what are those patterns or the stages that is important to see. In fact, the first important stage of first important pattern or the sign Brinton calls is prodromal signs. That is, he takes it from the French Revolution. That is a preliminary sign of revolution. There are certain preliminary signs when intelligentsia is unhappy, when the coffer is empty, or many other signs which are to be seen at the initial stage, and he called it prodromal signs of revolution. The second stage is fever, when the outbreak of revolutionary action starts or happens, and here we find that the full symptoms are visible, and advances and retreats both are made during this period, the period of fever. First is prodromal sign, then you have the fever. Third is the stage of crisis. What happens is, in a stage there is a delirium, there is a reign of terror, and so on and so forth. And the fourth is the stage of convalescence, when basically the recovery, when the revolution is over. In fact, what happens that a lot of questions are opened up. Old stage is restored or the new one is created. And these issues become very debatable and open issues in this post-revolutionary period or phase, what he calls the phase of or stage of convalescence. Now in France, what Crane Brinton says, that what happened, that Napoleon's coming to power in fact, was the initiation of the period of convalescence. It is also the period in French history of reaction. Similarly, in Russia, Brinton says that Lenin's new economic policy, when he gave concession to the bourgeoisie, was also part of that reaction in this period of convalescence. And here, in fact, there is a possibility of, according to Brinton, a thermidorial reaction or thermidorial revolution, many people call, but it was a thermidorial reaction. Yet what happened, that the dream of a new society remains unfulfilled, and the rightists gain upper hand because the left-leaning intellectuals, ideologues, and the politics, they fail, and therefore here a thermidorial reaction, the rightist reaction happens. And it is context of France, he says, that the Napoleon's coming to power was a thermidorial reaction. In Russia, Lenin, as I mentioned, the new economic policy, the concession to the bourgeoisie, was a thermidorial reaction. Of course, one thing is interesting to see that in context of English and American Revolution, Brinton argues that no thermidorial reaction took place like it happened in France and Russia. So this is what Brinton talks about the stages of revolution. Of course, he also talks about many causes of revolution. For example, he argues that one is the ideologues propagate revolution in early phase, but then during fever period, it is basically the fanatics who play important role, not the ideologues. And when the crisis is over, the men of action take over, and this is what he says, that during thermidorial phase, in fact the convalescence phase, because thermidorial phase happens during the convalescence phase, men of action dominate, not those fanatics, perhaps the way they dominate in the stage of fever. There are many causes which have been underlined by Brinton. Economic crisis. One is basically the economic crisis, the way many other thinkers have also highlighted. When the treasury is empty, the way it was the case in France. In 1640, he gives the example of United States of America. The taxation crisis, when the colonies demanded independence and they gave a slogan, no taxation without representation. 1789 France, the state general was in the bad shape. 1917 Russia, in fact, after First World War, there were a lot of economic difficulties, and all these signs were the signs of economic distress. Then therefore, prodromal signs, that is the structural weakness in both economy and polity. Now the third is, these are the prodromal signs, that is economic crisis, the structural signs. Then you have the government and its inefficiency. That is another important factor. Third is the desertion of intellectuals. For example, what happens, the legitimation process is threatened. In fact, postal politics, secret societies, and many other societies flourished in France. In Russia, you have anarchists, nihilists, socialists, they coming to the scene. And therefore, this desertion of intellectual is important. And then finally, challenge to the old class, that is the ruling class gets divided among themselves. So these are some of the factors which have been highlighted by Crane Brinton as the causes of revolution, particularly the 4 revolutions which he discusses. That takes me to the next important contribution from historical explanation. His Barrington Moore Jr., Social Origin of Dictatorship and Democracy, written in 1966. In fact, Barrington Moore talks about 3 major routes. One is the democratic route, that is the France and Britain. Second is the fascist route, that is Germany, Italy and Japan. And the third is the communist route, that is Russia and China. And then of course it also talks of India, but he doesn't give any name for this 4th route, because that is a puzzle for him. Because what Barrington Moore Jr. argues, that no bourgeoisie, no democracy. If you don't have bourgeoisie, you should not expect democratic transformation. Because democracy's future, according to Barrington Moore, depends on the commercialization of agriculture. That how this agriculture question is settled. For Moore, elimination of present question is best for democracy. Britain, this issue was settled through enclosure movement. United States of America, fortunately there was no peasantry, there was only commercial farming class, and therefore this issue didn't come up. But in Britain this matter was settled effectively, and therefore farm routes for democracy were created. In Soviet Union and China, in fact, what happened, and Japan and Germany, the 4 countries, peasantry survived. But in Soviet Union and China, it was done differently by the Communist Party. And therefore, in fact, it makes a difference, because Soviet Union and China is a socialist route, whereas Japan and Germany, it is called, a capitalism from above, and therefore the fascist route. So, but all 4, in fact, Soviet Union, China, Japan and Germany, according to Barrington Moore, all had at some stage dictatorship because of this, the manner and the method through which this peasant issue was settled. Now, of course, India, according to Barrington Moore Jr., democracy has survived, but peasant question has lingered. It was rather unaddressed. So, therefore, this is an important explanation. In fact, the role of different classes in revolutions. This is what Barrington Moore Jr. tries to explain through his model. In fact, a strategy of the rising commercial class is perhaps the subject matter of study. In fact, how sharply the feudal remnants are destroyed and how they have effectively helped in bringing democracy is perhaps the major issue addressed in this writing so far as the theory of revolution is concerned. One can say that Barrington Moore Jr. has tried to give social explanation of modernization, which stands for revolution. So therefore, when he comes to India, he said it is a novel case. It is a multi-class Congress party which brought about change, that is freedom, and therefore bourgeoisie was not anti-feudal. The problem of land reforms lingered, inequality and poverty persisted, and no anti-feudal revolutions, hence the problem for democracy was continuing. But of course, the way India has witnessed successful institutionalization of democratic politics is something which basically defies this explanation of Moore in his book. There are many criticisms of Barrington Moore. One is that he generalizes the British model and consider it an idea. The way Crane Brinton generalized the French model and considered it ideal, Moore generalizes the British model. In fact, many scholars have pointed out that Barrington Moore doesn't have a theory of class formation. The last school is the structuralist school given by Theda Skocpol, and she discusses France, Russia and China in her book State and Revolution. In fact, her major contribution is focusing on institutions and state. Therefore, that famous book which she wrote, Bringing a State Back In, should be read along with this book, State and Revolution. In fact, her famous statement that revolutions have happened without revolutionaries. Therefore, her entire structural explanation or analysis focuses on the crisis of a state and patterns of class dominance. The 3 important factors she highlights is external stress on a state, breakdown of the capacity to maintain order, and the third is the existence of a strong community structure among peasants. In fact, a lot of scholars believe it is a non-Marxist search for a macro parameters to understand the revolutionary transformation in history. There are, of course, a structuralist, internationalist, and statist features which she tries to highlight through her writing, and therefore one finds that her entire argument is that both political and social transformation have to accompany each other if really a social a revolution is to take place. In fact, therefore she believed that the Puritan revolution was not a revolution because no social transformation took place. In fact, industrial revolution was upheaval in social but not political, and therefore, in fact, if both accompany social and political upheaval, one can say that revolutionary transformation has taken place. So these are some of the important theories and arguments which we find in comparative politics so far as the understanding of revolution is concerned.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. And friends, so here we have completed theories of revolution in comparative politics. So you can watch all the other lectures too, which are there for you on YouTube. This lecture is also going to be uploaded. So keep watching us, keep writing us at info.cec@nic.in. We would be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.